Hey, it's Brett, and this is Brett and Some Books. Today we are starting a new book called The Plot to Seize the White House by Jules Archer. This is the shocking true story of the conspiracy to overthrow FDR, or Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And this is an important piece of history because it coincides with a lot of what we're seeing right now, and the rise of fascism. And I have wanted to keep this as non-political as possible with my book selection, but now it kind of seems a little bit more urgent to put some materials out there from history that help us to look at what's currently going on and make informed choices. So the introduction is written by Anne C. Venzen. Few, if any, events jeopardized the stability of the United States more than the Great Depression, which dominated the entire decade of the 1930s. Breadlines, bank failures, tramps riding the rails, the Dust Bowl, hopeless Okies praying they'd find work in California, and suicides from Wall Street skyscrapers were all realities of the era. The crash of Black Tuesday, October 29, 1929, was no respecter of class. Everyone was affected from Main Street to the main line. In July 1932, veterans of World War I, desperate for the bonus promised to them at the close of the conflict, but not payable until 1945, marched on Washington to demand an early payout. President Herbert Hoover, the same man who fed starving children in Belgium during World War I and brought aid to a devastated Europe after the Great War, seemed helpless in the face of such unprecedented economic devastation. The election of Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1932 brought a new approach, a, quote, New Deal, end quote, aimed at pulling the country back from the edge of the abyss. FDR's programs, which he set into motion in the famous 100 Days, included a bank holiday to determine the solvency of the remaining institutions, as well as the establishment of the FDIC and SEC. At the time, these programs seemed quite literally revolutionary, as they placed unmatched oversight on economic institutions. However, it was the president's desire to abandon the gold standard that stunned both the super-rich, who had felt fairly insulated from the Depression, and a significant number of average Americans who believed that Roosevelt was flirting with Bolshevism. The U.S. was not alone in its economic desperation. Governments the world over were collapsing, often replaced with equally feeble regimes which just offered more of the same. The only nations which seemed to provide a degree of order and stability for their people were Italy and Germany, but they were under the thumb of fascist dictatorships. In the early days of both regimes, outsiders only saw improved employment figures and growing economies. Opponents of Roosevelt's New Deal began to wonder if they might find a, quote, man on horseback, end quote, who could rally a force to oust the administration and replace it with a regime similar to Italy's corporate state. Nothing like that had ever happened in U.S. history, but conditions had never been so bad. The conspirators faced two questions. Where would they find such a man, and where would he find his troops? Thoughts immediately turned to the 20,000-man bonus army, veterans who knew how to fight and had already expressed their desperation and extreme discontent with the status quo. Would they be enough? Probably not. However, the recently founded American Legion, with over 500,000 members, might. But it would take an extraordinary event or individual to persuade them to take up arms against the country which they had fought for in the trenches of the Western Front. The leader would have to be charismatic and utterly fearless, a soldier's general with a national reputation. Who better than Marine Major General Smedley D Butler? Butler dropped out of his Quaker high school in 1898 and joined the Marines at 16 to fight in the Spanish-American War. He prided himself on being a roughneck, happier marching with his men than marching the halls of power. Many of the veterans knew Butler from their time at Camp Pontoise, where they waited to be transported home from France. Others remembered his exploits in the Nicaragua, Haiti, the Philippines, Mexico, and China, where he earned 2 Medals of Honor and countless other decorations. Still others had seen or heard him on the lecture circuit after his retirement. Butler was discontent in his own right, having been passed over for the post of Commandant of the Marine Corps in 1931. He had gradually concluded that the State Department had used his Marines in Central America to further so-called dollar diplomacy. But more important to those considering a coup d'etat was his impassioned speech to the bonus marchers on July 19, 1932. Whipping off his jacket in the sweltering, sticky July heat of Washington, D.C., he rolled up his sleeves and stomped back and forth across the platform. In his raspy voice, with its signature staccato delivery that mimicked bursts from a machine gun, he told the marchers to follow the law, but expressed his support for their cause with the passion of a revivalist preacher and the hells and damns of a drill sergeant. Who better to lead the oust of FDR in the New Deal? In the pages that follow, Jules Archer weaves a tale of intrigue, clandestine meetings, wealthy interests who remained in the shadows, the formation of the Congressional Special Committee on Un-American Activities, the McCormick-Dickstein Committee, and an outraged general who may have been convinced that war is a racket, but would do everything in his power to expose the plotters because he believed in the Constitution and the oath he had taken to defend it. By Anne C. Venzen, 2014. The foreword. This is the true story of a remarkable American who, during the early New Deal years, was sought by wealthy plotters in the United States to lead a putsch to overthrow the government and establish an American fascist dictatorship. According to retired Representative John W. McCormick, former Speaker of the House, if the late Major General Smedley Butler of the U.S. Marine Corps had not been a stubborn devotee of democracy, Americans today could conceivably be living under an American Mussolini, Hitler, or Franco. An ironic aspect of the conspiracy General Butler unmasked is that few Americans have ever heard about it, or even know anything about the general. As children, all of us were taught about the treason of Aaron Burr and Benedict Arnold, whose betrayals were safely cobwebbed in the distant past. But school texts that deal with the New Deal are uniquely silent about the powerful Americans who plotted to seize the White House with the private army, hold President Franklin D. Roosevelt prisoner, and get rid of him if he refused to serve as their puppet in a dictatorship they planned to impose and control. There is strong evidence to suggest that the conspirators may have been too important politically, socially, and economically to be brought to justice after their scheme had been exposed before the McCormick-Dickstein Committee at the House of Representatives. The largely anti-Roosevelt press of the New Deal era scotched the story as expeditiously as possible by outright suppression, distortion, and attempts to ridicule General Butler's testimony as capricious fantasy. Smedley Butler's whole life, however, was proof that he was a man of incorruptible character, integrity, and patriotism, with a deserved reputation for bluntly speaking the whole truth at all times, regardless of consequences. He was named by Theodore Roosevelt, quote, the outstanding American soldier, end quote. The The official Marine Corps record calls him, quote, one of the most colorful officers in the Marine Corps' long history, and one of the 2 Marines who received 2 medals of honor for separate acts of outstanding heroism, end quote. He was decorated no fewer than 20 times. Former Speaker McCormick told the author, quote, in peace or war, he was one of the most outstanding Americans in our history. I can't emphasize too strongly the very important part he played in exposing the fascist plot in the early 1930s, backed by and planned by persons possessing tremendous wealth, end quote. The crucial events of the plot to seize the White House unfolded between July and November 1933, with hearings before the McCormick-Dickstein Committee begun in New York City on November 20th, 1934. On November 26th, the committee submitted to the House of Representatives its final report, verifying completely the testimony of General Butler. This book might help break some of the seals of silence that have kept Americans from knowing the truth about the conspiracy. As the first effort to tell the whole story of the plot in sequence and full detail, it may serve as a fresh reminder of Wendell Phillips' warning about the price of liberty. No American was ever more dedicated to eternal vigilance in preserving our freedom under the Bill of Rights than the remarkable war hero, pacifist, and Republican Democrat Smedley Darlington Butler. Acknowledgements. I am deeply indebted first and foremost to the immediate family of the late General Smedley D Butler, daughter Mrs. Ethel Peters Whaley, and son Smedley Butler Jr. and Thomas Richard Butler, for their generous cooperation, for use of the General's private and military papers, scrapbooks, memorabilia, recordings, and photos, and for vivid personal recollections of their father. Sincere gratitude is also expressed to the following persons and institutions for their contributions to my research. Former Speaker of the House of Representatives John W. McCormick, who headed the McCormick-Dickstein Committee and who answered all my questions about the hearings he held during which Smedley Butler testified about the conspiracy. General David M. Shoup, retired Commandant of the United States Marine Corps, who served under General Butler in China and who shared some of his reminiscences with me. George Seldes, whose letter In Fact and books 1,000 Americans and Facts and Fascism gave me my first inklings of the conspiracy many years ago, and who generously helped me with my research efforts. John L. Spivak, former foreign correspondent for International News Service, who rendered invaluable cooperation by answering all my questions and generously permitting me to quote from his own fascinating reminiscence, A Man in His Time, in which he relates how he was able to thwart efforts to suppress important names involved in the conspiracy. Senator Jacob Javits and Representative Hamilton Fish, Jr., who assisted me in obtaining copies of the testimony at the conspiracy hearings of the McCormick-Dickstein Committee. E.Z. Dimitman, former executive editor of the Philadelphia Inquirer and a close friend of General Butler's, who shared his reminiscences of the general. Jerry Doyle, Philadelphia Daily News staff artist, who helped me locate old friends of the general's. Jesse Leventhal, Philadelphia newsman, confidant, and press secretary for the general's Senate campaign, now retired, who explained some of the behind-the-scenes political factors. Tom O'Neill, former city editor of the Philadelphia Record at the time of the conspiracy, who helped put some of the pieces of the puzzle together. William J. Stewart, acting director, National Archives and Records Service, Franklin D. Roosevelt Library. Don't be a terrorist. Who guided me through the Roosevelt papers and locating material pertaining to General Butler. and help me identify sources. Mary Schutz and Charlotte Wright of the Mid-Hudson Library System, Poughkeepsie, New York, who obtained for me rare and hard-to-get research on the conspiracy from universities and public libraries all over the East Coast. James Brock, Ethel Tornapore, and Jane McGarvey of Adrian's Library in Poughkeepsie and the Starr Institute Library, Rhinebeck, New York. Nita M. Westlake, Curator, Rare Book Collection. Charles Patterson Van Pelt Library, University of Pennsylvania, and Mary Lou Ulm of the Pine Plains, New York Library. Colonel F.C. Caldwell, U.S. Marine Corps, retired, Director of Marine Corps History, Historical Division, who gave me valuable research leads and provided me with helpful articles and public records from Marine Corps sources. Warrant Officer D.R. Eggers, U.S. Marine Corps Head, Administrative Section, Director of Information, for providing certain Marine Corps photos of General Butler. Catholic University of America, Washington, D.C., which permitted me to study a 1962 master's thesis in library science by A. Eunice M. Lyon, the unpublished papers of Major General Smedley Darlington Butler, United States Marine Corps, a calendar, based on files turned over by the Butler family to the Marine Corps. Robert B. Pitkin, editor, American Legion magazine, who gave me statistical information about past Legion commanders. Donald R. McCoy, History of the University of Kansas, for granting permission to quote from his book, Coming of Age, the United States during the 1920s and 30s. Assistant Professor Dane Archer of the University of California, Santa Cruz, who originally researched the conspiracy for me 8 years ago in old newspaper files at Yale's University Sterling Library. My wife, Eleanor E. Archer, who helped me in interviews with Speaker McCormick, General Shoup, and General Butler's family, as well as serving as advisor, critic, indexer, and proofreader. Time magazine, for permission to quote from its article, Plot Without Plotters, published December 3, 1934. Susan Berkowitz and Joan Nagy, whose brilliant editorial help aided me in sifting and organizing the elements in this book to let what remained stand out like gold dust in a prospecting pan. Jules Archer, Pine Plains, New York. And finally, personal editorial is that stay away from hero worship. Even if somebody you feel is a national treasure, it's good to never forget that there are no heroes, and just waiting on you to do your part. That's all that you can do.